Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Sam Gleave Riemann, and I produce the podcast here at the Indian Ocean World Center at McGill University, Montreal. Today I am stepping into the host role as I am very pleased to welcome our usual host, Dr. Philip Gooding, to discuss his first monograph, On the Frontiers of the Indian Ocean World, A History of Lake Tanganyika circa 1830 to 1890, published by Cambridge University Press last year in 2022. Philip completed his PhD in history at SOAS University of London in 2017 and joined the IOWC as a Postdoctoral Fellow in 2018. Since then, he has published a number of chapters and articles, co-edited 2 edited volumes, and now produced his first monograph. Along with founding and hosting this podcast, he is also managing editor of the Journal of Indian Ocean World Studies. Philip, welcome.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be on this side of the interview for a change.
It's a little bit strange to be on this side of the interview instead of just sitting in as a producer. As you know, we planned this podcast episode to answer a few questions that we didn't get to at the book launch back in November. I have at least one question from each of your 2 respondents, but first, for the benefit of listeners who could not attend the launch or have not yet read the book, could you please introduce us to your key arguments, methods, and the origins of the project?
So the idea for this book, from very early stages, even in my master's thesis and in my PhD proposal, was to study the history of Lake Tanganyika. From very early days, actually, I conceived Lake Tanganyika as a frontier zone. And you'll note that that's actually found its way into the final monograph, which was basically published 11 years after the beginning of my master's program. So I think that's quite surprising, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to people embarking on their master's programs now, thinking that the ideas that they're going to have now are going to actually find their way into a book. What I will say is that what kind of my idea of the frontier kind of changed and shifted over time. Originally, kind of my idea was to study Lake Tanganyika as kind of a distinct zone of interaction between several African states in the 19th century. Now, these 19th century African states received a lot of attention from historians writing in the 1960s and 1970s, basically in the aftermath of African independence at the height of African nationalism. And very much this is a period of new forms of statehood in Africa. Now, a lot of the thinking then, I think, within the historical faculty was to think about the antecedents to this new wave of African nationalism. Would understanding statehood in pre-colonial, in inverted commas, Africa help us to understand current nation states? And with that in mind, there are lots of studies on Mirambo State, situated in present-day West Central Tanzania, on Msiri State in southeastern DRC, Buganda in present-day Uganda, Nyungu Yamawe State in present-day southwestern Tanzania. As you may have gathered from that kind of very sketchy geography I was giving you there, Lake Tanganyika doesn't get studied in this period, or not in its own right. It does fleet into all of these studies of statehood, but it's very much on the edge. It's not given its own kind of historiography or analysis in its own right. And I thought that was very much because of the kind of era that people were writing at that time. Now, in the interim period after the 1970s, kind of the study of pre-colonial Africa kind of went in decline. There was a lot more study focusing on the colonial period for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, another body of work kind of emerged, focusing on borderlands and frontiers in Africa. And the kind of borderland studies, which actually had its origins in analyses of the United States-Mexico border, the idea that these kind of frontier areas, these borderland areas, have kind of an outsized influence on what's going on at political centers. And you can kind of see, if you think about kind of that example that I've just drawn on there from the US-Mexico border, about how the debates about the wall, which are still ongoing, really shape political culture in Washington, D.C. So there's kind of an emergent thought, and this is going kind of gain traction in African studies significantly with its own modifications, about the idea that these frontier zones, these borderlands, have had a significant influence on states in the present and in the recent past. So kind of my opening research question is kind of really trying to understand what happens to our understanding of 19th century statehood in Africa if we center Lake Tanganyika as kind of a borderland or a frontier zone that links and also divides all these different states. I think that has some quite good theoretical grounding, and that kind of seems quite an exciting thing to explore. The problem was I didn't actually find anything that would support anything related to that. Actually, the work done in the 1960s and 70s had done a really good job, actually, of actually writing about Lake Tanganyika and integrating it into its role of all these different states, and actually it didn't warrant centering Lake Tanganyika in a way that kind of linked all of them in any particular way. It just didn't work, despite what we may know about more recent borders and frontiers in the more recent past. But one of the things that also made me think about Lake Tanganyika in this context was also challenging conventional notions of space that always focused on political centers. And that also not just had kind of an influence on how you're trying to understand the 19th century between these different states, also has current day implications as well. Because Lake Tanganyika now is on the border of 4 nation states. That's Tanzania, Burundi, DRC, and Zambia. And what I really wanted to do was write a history of East Africa outside of these kind of colonial zones and try and really challenge conventional spatial frames in East African history. And I think most Africanists would kind of see that as kind of an admirable pursuit, and I think most Africanists even do so. But as several scholars have kind of recently reflected, these kind of spatial zones that divide it between the bounds of these modern nation states that were imposed by colonial rulers actually have shaped significantly kind of the spatial markers of studies of the African past. And I really wanted to go against that. And then that led me to also conversations with histories of the Indian Ocean world, which seek to do likewise, challenging all these kind of different spatial silos between East Africa, Northeast Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And then I could really see a lot of the influences that have kind of shaped Indian Ocean world studies in also arriving and being very prominent on the shores of Lake Tanganyika just through my archival research. So what I ended up doing here is kind of really challenging spatial frames within African history on its own by challenging these colonial lines that are drawn on the map and putting that also into conversation with kind of a scholarly movement that's really taken off. Well, it really began in the late 70s, mid 80s, but it's really taken off in the last 20 years. That have sought to do the same, but on a much grander scale. So I think if we talk about like the origins of the project, we're very much about challenging spatial frames and revising how we understand a space in pre-colonial African history. This kind of took on a much bigger, more macro approach when we put it into conversation with the Indian Ocean world. I think that's probably the larger contribution of the book, is that we're trying to understand this zone on its own merits in ways that directly challenge how Europeans at the time and how Eurocentric narratives now even might conceptualize the history of Lake Tanganyika and of East Africa.
That's fantastic. I just want to drill down a little bit more on one other part. Right? This is one of the questions that I had when I was reading through here, specifically about methodology, because as you know, I am not an Indian Ocean world scholar originally. I come from the ancient Mediterranean, but I felt a lot of familiarity when I was reading this book because you draw on a whole diversity of sources because the paper archive is so sparse, just like it is for the ancient Mediterranean. I wonder if you could speak to this, to the archaeological research, to the climatic data that you're using. What was the methodology that you used to approach this diversity of sources, and what benefits do you see from using this sort of methodology?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you alluded to it right there, documentary sources are quite sparse for East Africa. In fact, they're notoriously sparse. There are a couple of exceptions, particularly in relation to Buganda and a couple of traders one particular trader who wrote kind of an autobiography. But almost all the sources for equatorial Eastern Africa, the inland regions, are written by, all the documentary sources are written by Europeans. So not only are they sparse, because there aren't that many of them, in terms of archival materials where you can kind of actually create like a change over time within one distinct source, they only start in the 1870s. And my book starts in 1830. So they're sparse, but they're also problematic. The authors have highly distorted understandings of the peoples, environments, climates, built environments of what they saw. They're shaped very much by their preconceived views of East Africa. And in many ways, they informed imperial knowledge production. They're highly problematic. So one of the things that is always, I think, useful to do in these kinds of studies is to find ways you can to read against the grain. And so the main kind of methodology I used for that, I suppose, were oral sources, particularly for the latter chapters on structures of bondage and on the spread of Islam. But as you alluded to as well, I used archaeological sources for understanding the layout of towns, climatological sources for understanding agricultural change, agricultural production, help to inform the success of agricultural change, and also anthropological sources, which were conducted by anthropologists in the second half of the 20th century and in the last 2 decades as well. In terms of the holistic way, again, in terms of, it's very similar to kind of my motivations behind how I understood Lake Tanganyika in space. It's about trying to challenge Eurocentric views. And while I think there is a method on its own for reading against the grain of European authored sources about Africa, you can inform this kind of methodology, at least in my view, by incorporating other sources as well. And when they're also so sparse, I don't see any logic in not trying to incorporate as many alternative sources as well. In many ways, as a historian, you need all the help you can get from as many disciplines as possible. And I kind of write on the blurb, it says this is the first interdisciplinary history of Lake Tanganyika. Well, yeah, and I think that just comes down to the point of, to make a history that really challenges Eurocentric framings, not just in terms of space, but in terms of concepts, you need to incorporate other sources and methodologies other than just kind of documentary history, because otherwise it's very easy to get caught up in, I suppose, the narratives that are held within the documentary archives. So that's kind of the logic behind using as many, I suppose, alternative or non-traditional, inverted commas, historical sources as possible.
I'm just going to keep going on this topic for a second because I think that the methodologies that you have here are very interesting. You mentioned just now that in the second half of the book, you're relying quite heavily on oral histories. But in the first half of the book, you have 3 chapters in that section that each have a very clear theme and each have a very clear methodology associated with that theme. So I'm thinking that you talk about climate data when you talk about agriculture, archaeology, and architecture in the built environment when you talk about the urban developments around the lake, and then anthropological methodology when you discuss spirituality. Do you think that there is a necessary relationship between these methodologies and these data sets and the themes that you talked to? Were there other ways that you wanted to integrate different methodologies when you talk about those other themes? Each of those could be a book in and of themselves. Was this an intentional choice? Was this just an accident based on the data that you had at hand?
Yeah, and you're right. And this is one of the comments made by Professor Elizabeth Elborn in the book launch itself, when she said that actually the fact that you cover so many of these themes, so that they very much could be seen as a book unto themselves because of all the different kind of methodology you've seen. So you're right, and I hadn't actually thought about the book in this way, but the first 3 chapters all incorporate kind of a somewhat different methodology, or even a different discipline. Chapter 1 is very much has a lot of archaeology. Chapter 2 has a lot of climatology, and chapter 3 has a lot of anthropology. And it's just because of my kind of thinking about these disciplines and their relationships to those chapters were very much because it was these disciplines themselves spoke to the themes of those chapters. So chapter 1 is on the built environment and, I suppose, the landscape of the urban space, or the emporium, as I've called it. Now, there's just an absolute trove of research that has gone into urban histories of the Swahili coast. And most of that is archaeological. And one of the threads in that archaeological research is on trying to understand the role of wattle and door buildings, or mud and thatch buildings from like colonial era and up to, I suppose, at least the mid 1990s. Most of the archaeology of the Swahili coast focused on stone buildings. For a variety of reasons. One, because stone buildings were very much seen to characterize the coast in a way that made it distinct from the interior. And this actually had a lot of racialized connotations that colonial rulers built on as well, which I probably don't need to get into here. But the other reason is that because stone buildings are easy to find in an archaeological record. Now, in the 1990s, one of the contributions of scholars such as Jeffrey Fleischer has been to study, as I said, wattle and door buildings that weren't stone, and they've discovered many. And actually kind of indicated that actually these are very prominent buildings, and the stone buildings are sometimes exceptional. And that wattle and daub has a significant influence in the archaeology, in the architecture, and the daily life of Swahili pasts. Now, if we think about that, then I was trying to think about, well, let's think about the how wattle and daub has recently been seen in the archaeological record as playing an important role in the East African coast. How is wattle and daub, which characterized all the buildings in the inland, how in what ways is the patterns of settlement patterns on the coast similar to the interior? Because you're trying to break down a boundary between this idea of a stone-built coast and a non-stone built inland area. So basically, when I was thinking about how to understand the urban spaces, it was very much trying to tap into the methodologies that other historians of East Africa, including of the coast, have also used to understand these urban spaces. And that archaeology really came to the fore, and that really helped. Then, I suppose, thinking about the role of climate was very much how does the East African climate, much like the rest of the Indian Ocean world, influences agricultural production in East Africa, including up to now, as we discussed in a recent podcast. Most agriculture is rain-fed, which means it's reliant on rainfall being brought by the Indian Ocean monsoon system. So what happens if that rainfall changes? And what agricultural practices took advantage of abundant rainfall, and what agricultural practices made the agricultural regimes more vulnerable in periods of drought? And when were these periods of drought? And kind of answering those questions, that means looking at climatological materials. Then anthropological ones, for chapter 3, there's been a kind of a decent amount of research, particularly focusing on the southern half of the lake, on the role of the lake and of spirits within the lake on everyday spiritual practices. These 3 chapters were about trying to understand the space around Lake Tanganyika, so both urban and rural, and also Lake Tanganyika itself and its role in daily life. And what I found in terms of other research into kind of these themes was that actually historians, maybe I'm making a generalization here, but historians of 19th century maybe have not gone into these themes in that much depth, and to actually really go further into them and to really conceptualize them as best as possible. This necessitated some cross-disciplinary analysis, taking some inspiration from colleagues in departments in archaeology, climatology, and anthropology to really understand them. So kind of in a roundabout way, to answer your question, why these kind of 3 disciplines, where they come from, is very much in response to the themes of the chapters themselves, to try and understand the space around and within Lake Tanganyika.
And I'm not going to belabor this point, but I know you and I have talked about, well, would it be interesting if we go and look at the material culture of the agricultural shifts in this period? And there are other avenues for future scholarship here. But you mentioned one of the respondents, so I guess I should get back to one of her questions. Dr. Elizabeth Elborn at the book launch asked, and we didn't have a chance to discuss, about Christian missionaries. So she's coming from a history of the British Empire in South Africa, and she was wondering about, where are the Christian missionaries here? You're using missionary sources, but are they really as peripheral to the actual lived experience of the people around the lake as they come across in the book? Do locals convert? What's the interaction like?
Yeah, I really like this question from Professor Elborn. Because so we've been talking about sources and different disciplines used in this book. And despite using all these other sources, archaeological, climatological, anthropological, oral, the one source type that really actually goes through the whole of the book are missionary sources. So I kind of use these other disciplines to try and interpret these missionary sources, and I suppose other European authored sources as well, as best as I possibly can, in a way that doesn't, I suppose, center the missionaries. In that process, I suppose I've almost gone, and this is the essence of the question from Professor Elborn, was, have I gone so far as to erase the role of the missionaries in the actual history, because I'm really trying to read across the grain? Have I gone almost erase them from the history kind of unnecessarily? My response to that would be no. I haven't. And actually, I really believe strongly, actually, the missionaries were massively peripheral to actually what was going on in terms of the longer term developments on Lake Tanganyika, at least up to 1890. There's some, I suppose, the one area where there's a little bit of change, a little bit of contestation here, which kind of gets mentioned in chapter 3, is kind of their role in boat building, which becomes kind of an important force as a part of Lake Tanganyika's history. But yeah, so missionaries started arriving on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1878. And these were members of the London Missionary Society and the French White Fathers. And they struggled massively to gain converts. The French White Fathers were probably more successful, but this was owing to in a large part, in their strategy of, in their terms, buying the freedom of enslaved people. Now, that's a highly problematic discourse. They're essentially buying slaves from people. They're reinforcing a slave trade, and the extent to which that they're buying their freedom is very debatable, considering that those that they did purchase were then obliged to work at the missionary and were given very, very limited freedoms. In addition to that, as I've kind of alluded to in another chapter, in chapter 6, I'm very skeptical of the extent to which the idea of slavery should be applied to many of the conditions that missionaries called slavery in African societies and under coastal traders, Swahili and Omani traders. To say the White Fathers were somewhat successful in gaining followers. The extent to which they gained real converts is another matter. The London Missionary Society basically completely failed. And actually, by the mid to late 1880s, I forget the exact date, it actually left Lake Tanganyika's shores to a place in present-day northern Zambia, which is about a couple of 100 kilometers actually away from the lake shore. And just because they couldn't gain converts, they just basically unable. And this kind of is actually in contrast to other parts of East Africa. For example, the Church Missionary Society and the French White Fathers were significantly more successful at gaining converts in Buganda, in present-day Uganda. So it is at odds with that history. But I think the reasons for it here around Lake Tanganyika is because of the influence of Islam and the way that Islam just was made much more compatible with existing spiritual beliefs, and also the ways in which kinship and bonds focused on clientage formed between Muslim and non-Muslim populations. And this actually encouraged a lot of conversion as well. And this is also kind of about material cultures of things brought from the coast, things like fashions from cotton cloths, also guns as well. Became part of kind of a vision of coastal cultures, and this was very influential on Lake Tanganyika's shores in ways that were incompatible, I think, with what missionaries wanted when they wanted to gain converts. So particularly the London Missionary Society, and to a lesser degree, the White Fathers, missionaries were really, I think, peripheral, almost outside observers of what was actually going on around Lake Tanganyika. And actually, although they wanted to have significant influence of what was going on, broadly speaking, they failed to do so. They only gained a greater foothold and greater influence after the establishment of colonial rule in the 1890s.
I think that's all fascinating. And you mentioned Islam there. And my follow-up question was a question from the other respondent, from Dr. Khalid Madani, which was about Islam, because he pointed to a passage where you discussed the idea of an Islamic Sea. And the Indian Ocean has been discussed as an Islamic Sea. And he was wondering, what's the extent of that? What does Islam look like around the lake? You talk very clearly that your oral respondents really do want to talk about Islam. That's one of the processes that they're really interested in. So, what does it mean for a community if there's no mosque? Is there a vernacular Islam? What about syncretism? You push back a little bit on the idea of syncretism. What does that mean? What does this Islam in this area look like?
This is, again, you're right. I'm glad you mentioned this, that I push back on the idea of syncretism. So the syncretism is the idea that I suppose, that two kind of spiritual beliefs could live side by side, and that some, I suppose, converts to Islam would both be Muslim but also have an indigenous religion, that they'd be side by side and not influence each other. And I'm kind of pushed back against this idea that this is what happened on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. This is very much influenced by other studies, firstly in colonial East Africa, particularly by Felicitas Becker, but also from the wider Indian Ocean world. I was really taken by, for example, Sebastian Prang's history of monsoon Islam, whereby the idea was that local spiritual beliefs did not exist side by side with new kind of beliefs in Islam, but actually the ways that they understood, that new converts understood Islam, was very much rooted in pre-existing beliefs. And where they practiced Islam was also rooted in these pre-existing beliefs as well. And also these pre-existing beliefs became modified to reconcile to their new belief in Islam. They don't live side by side, but actually they're very much integrated with each other, and they become a broader religious practice that can broadly be understood as Islamic. And this is very much how I kind of see it going on here. Now, of course, kind of in, how we traditionally understand Islam, we're going to think about the 5 pillars of Islam. We're going to think about mosques. Now, I think in this kind of practice on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, these new converts, as well as Muslim traders coming from the coast who don't have a mosque, don't so much reinterpret Islam, but adapt Islamic practice to their local context. This local context doesn't have a mosque, but this local context does have widespread belief in spirits in the lake, which are not incompatible. In fact, they become very compatible with Islamic beliefs in jinns. So the idea of putting it on this idea of an Islamic sea was the fact that this belief in spirits in the lake, and as this becomes intertwined with a local understanding of Islam, this kind of really becomes pervasive over the entire lake. And this is kind of me trying to put the conversation of Lake Tanganyika into broader conversation with the scholarship of the Indian Ocean world. And the Indian Ocean itself has been understood as an Islamic sea. Most notably, I think, in Edward Alper's Indian Ocean in World History, published just over a decade ago. In this kind of Islamic sea, and as I mentioned, Prang's book really refers to this as well, that Islam takes diverse forms over time and over space. And I think this is kind of really, this conception of Lake Tanganyika as an Islamic sea kind of emphasized that Islam had kind of a diversity of forms around Lake Tanganyika, influenced by Islamic practice on the East African coast, but also taking on distinctly local components as well. And rather than seeing it as kind of syncretic, as somehow distinct belief systems, I wanted to put it in conversation with these broader understanding of a diversity of Islam, which kind of transcends recent studies into the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we're going to ask one more question, and this is another one. I'm going to kind of mix some of my questions with one of the questions from Elizabeth from the launch before we get to our usual final question. And Elizabeth's question was about continuity and change, and what's that narrative stretch in the book, especially when it regards to the process of colonialism. And I was thinking about this when I was reading through the book after the launch, especially when I came to your really thoughtful epilogue, where you bring forward the 1888 Abushiri Rebellion and use that to illustrate connections between the Indian Ocean coast and Lake Tanganyika itself. Can you speak a little bit to this idea of continuity and change? How does the Abushiri Revolt illustrate this sense that the lake and the ocean are connected, and this transition between colonial and non-colonial periods in the 19th century?
Thanks, yeah. And thanks for referring to the epilogue as well. It's the one, obviously, the shortest chapter in the book. It's an epilogue, it's not really a chapter. But I think it's the one that it's both the one I was the most unsure about when I sent it off in the original manuscript, also the one that I thought that if this is acceptable, was possibly the most impactful, or at least close to the most impactful of the whole book. And this is the idea, I'm kind of building on Jonathan Glassman's seminal book, Feast and Riot, published in the mid-1990s, which really was challenging understandings of, as you referred to, continuity and change around the end of the 1880s and early 1890s. Up to the publication of Jonathan Glassman's book, the Abushiri Revolt, which began as a series of riots in coastal towns such as Bagamoyo and Pangani, and then later turned into a wider revolt of Omani and Swahili planters. up to Glassman's book, was kind of seen as a revolt against the German incursions on the coast. This is the beginning of basically when the Germans are really laying claim to mainland East Africa, and is a revolt against that. Glassman's kind of contention was actually, no, these revolts, and particularly the outbreak, the riots, are actually tied to longer term conflicts and tensions that have been born out of changes within coastal society, dating from at least 1856, which is, I think, is the start date of his book. My kind of contribution to that was actually to kind of understand that the rioters themselves, many of them came from inland regions. And the rioters were people who were largely disenfranchised at the coast. They were many coming from the interior. This meant that coastal populations, broadly speaking, referred to them as un-Islamic, as of slave stock. Now, as I argue in the book, significantly, one of the main threads about the book, particularly in the latter two chapters, is that these people, despite being regarded of slave stock by people living at the coast and also regarded as enslaved by European missionaries, didn't see themselves as enslaved, and neither did their so-called masters. They didn't see them as enslaved. They saw them as somewhere on a continuum, more likely as clients, or for many women as kin to some degree. And also, many of them had converted to Islam and had participated in this diversification of Islamic forms around Lake Tanganyika. So kind of my contribution here is kind of see that there's this long-term changes happening within cultural milieu at the coast and in the interior, and they are going kind of hand in hand. And this creates kind of long-term tensions which explode dramatically on the East African coast. So kind of in kind of this idea of continuity and change, is I think there is a great deal of change, particularly cultural change, and in terms of structures of bondage as well, around Lake Tanganyika, which really inform our understanding of the Abashiri revolt. And this kind of challenges and adds more to Glassman's core argument, was that 1888, the revolt, the riots followed by the revolt, don't necessarily indicate a sharp rupture with the beginning of colonial rule, but rather there is a long-term unfolding tension which colonial rulers insert themselves into unknowingly, I think, for the most part, and become imbricated in as they begin to establish colonial rule. The broad thread here about continuity and change, I think, is that the history that I'm trying to write here has longer-term implications in terms of how we understand the imposition of colonial rule from the 1890s. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to think about just a sharp rupture at this point. I think if you focus on the sharp rupture, you kind of attribute way too much influence to the Europeans, and it's kind of a Eurocentric narrative. Glassman began that process in terms of just looking at the coast, and I kind of given it a bigger spatial framework, also thinking about the interior and the interior's influence at the coast as well. I think that's kind of how I'm trying to think about it, at least.
I think that's a really fantastic answer. So then, of course, we get to finish and you get to answer the question that you always ask. What is coming next? What can we expect to see from you in the near to mid-term?
Okay, so there's a few things going on, but to draw listeners' attention to one, the big project is a climate history of East Africa, or equatorial Eastern Africa, from about 1750 to around 1900. And the idea with this history is to use, again, climatological methods, which are kind of explored in chapter 2 of the book, and I've got much more heavily into now, not just using existing climatological sources, but actually trying to make my own myself. Or actually, that's overstating what I'm doing here. In collaboration with climatologists, that are actually attempting to do this. And the idea is essentially, it's definitely a reflection on the current moment, which puts the climate crisis and the role of climate in the present and future, but also increasingly also in the past. That the climate does have a role, although not, but also pushing it back against old school, largely discredited deterministic roles as well. The idea here is I'm trying to gradually use a mixture of historical and climatological methods to reconstruct rainfall variability in East Africa from about 1750 to 1900, and then to use that as a new archive and with which to interpret East African history that interpretation will focus on the role of climatic and environmental changes in that context. So it's an environmental history that takes seriously the role of climate. And to do that, it necessitates actually understanding climate in the first place. And that's where I'm currently at the moment. Hopefully there'll be a manuscript under review within the next 6 weeks that actually reconstructs, that actually use some pretty novel interdisciplinary methods for actually reconstructing past climatic conditions in East Africa. This is absolutely integral for the history of East Africa, but it should also be said, and I think this is one of the important things as well. So I think this has important present day implications as well. One of the things that climatologists are very concerned with is modeling climate and how it is being affected currently, and trying to understand how that might impact climate systems in the future. One of the ways to improve your way of doing this is to lengthen your understanding in terms of time, how far back our knowledge of climate variability and change actually goes in the world. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, in terms of actual rain gauge data for East Africa, there's very little for pre-1900. So what this kind of project is also doing is adding to climatological knowledge of past conditions in East Africa, which will basically improve the models on which projections for future climates are made. That's the hope. Anyway, as I said, there should be a manuscript under review in the next little while. And if that gets through, we'll see. Then we have the makings of a new climate archive for East Africa, which will be then the basis of another book. But we'll see.
We will see. I know from being around the center, I see the sausage getting made, and it's quite an exciting sausage. So our listeners should look out for that. Thank you, Philip, for coming on the show and taking the time this morning to talk us through your book a little bit more. Thank you to the listeners for streaming and downloading the podcast. You've been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast. We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership, Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.